the laws which is implemented by Gaddafi against the Libyan people, which is absolutely crash, or they don't go with the international law, also the human rights conventions, and we have campaigned since 2006 to raise awareness here in the UK, writing to MPs, writing to the previous government, and try to bring the attention to them. And we have received an answer from Gerard Kaufman. Gerard Kaufman, my MP, he wrote to us in response of our question, why and how can Britain make deals with a dictator like Gaddafi? And his response was, if we don't make deals with dictators like Gaddafi, we are not going to have business with anyone. So it is clearly, now it is a new era. It is the people's era. And it's the revolution, and the people will take over, and the West, they have to respect their decision, and they have to respect their own determination. In Libya, they are very worried. The Libyan people very awake not to be hijacked, or their revolution to be hijacked by the West, and then they send an army to put, that they want to support the Libyans and safeguard them, and then they will stay there forever, like what we see in Iraq, what we see in other regions in the world. We want to make sure that the international community, the UN, the European, the EU,
Peggy,
and the whole world.
Peggy Hicks, if I could just
Yes.
turn back to you for a moment on this. Is there a sense here that certain Western nations basically got their fingers burned here for spending too much time cozying up to Gaddafi's regime, and that this is really the only reason that they're acting now?
Well, I think the point obviously does come following directly on Mubarak's fall in Egypt. I mean, that you can't separate the two in that way. And in that case, of course, there was, incredible concern over the fact that this person who had been had so much support from allies like the U.S., military aid as well, that decision, now that the people were rising up in a different direction, looked very short-sighted. Gaddafi, I think, is a somewhat different case in that there obviously was less of that sort of cozy relationship. But I think your speaker is absolutely right that there are those who were trying to do deals and move things forward. And I think this does show that those types of short-term calculations of what's good business may not make sense in a longer-term reality where it increases instability and violates people's rights, and we absolutely have to stand by the people.
Sorry to interrupt, but if events in Libya, events inside Libya essentially die down and we reach some sort of a stalemate there, and it's not at the top of the headlines every day as it has been for the last week or so, are you confident that the diplomats in Geneva will follow through on what they've been saying?
Yeah, I think the tide on this one has turned very substantially. And I do think that there will be follow-through. It's a question, of course, how effective some of that will be, but I think that the tools that are in place, the asset freezes, as I mentioned, the arms embargoes, the travel bans, the possibility of the ICC engaging in a very substantial way. And remember, the Human Rights Council itself put in place a commission of inquiry to investigate the abuses that are occurring as well. These are all measures that we've seen time and time again actually do have an impact, maybe not immediately, but over time.
Tariq Youssef, I saw you nodding in agreement to some of what you heard just there. Do you want to respond?
Absolutely. I would. I think the tide has definitely turned. You can no longer hide what's happening in your country, notwithstanding whatever efforts that are being made to kind of conceal and create confusion. All the images, videos, interviews, information coming out of Libya suggest that the international community will be watching, and that the warnings and threats expressed today will be taken rather seriously. I would also go further and say that we're not only waiting for the Human Rights Council to move, I think Western powers led by the US, precisely the countries that have accommodated Gaddafi in the last 7 or 8 years during a period of normalization, are acting out of a sense of guilt and have plenty of interest to ensure that the transition for him out of the country will be as smooth as possible and will be as least damaging and unstable as possible. This suggests that even beyond the human rights issues, there are growing efforts and perhaps steps being taken to ensure that Gaddafi is barricaded inside of the AlJazeera army barracks where he is located right now, and that members of the regime, the inner circle around him, are being contacted with pressures and perhaps also incentives to persuade them to not launch the counterattacks and not engage in further bloodshed. So human rights issues, global geostrategic issues, oil issues, all of these make Libya especially important. And the international community, I think, is going to be deploying all the instruments it has at its disposal, both unilaterally and multilaterally, to ensure that the transition away from Gaddafi's rule is going to be a smooth one.
But if whatever action the international community takes on this, is it ultimately going to depend on what happens inside Libya and what action the Libyan people take, just as we saw with events in Egypt and Tunisia?
I agree with you. Libya, however, is a bit more complicated. You've got a huge geographical space with a small population, population density. The army is rather decentralized, too many commanders, too many loyalties, tribal, political, security, and otherwise. It is not entirely inconceivable that some of the commanders around Gaddafi himself, who might be the subject of international persuasion and international pressure, might take matters into their own hands and defect from the regime and end matters within Tripoli. That would be the kind of international intervention that could bring swift end to what we're seeing in Libya and perhaps eliminate the possibility of bloodshed taking place in the large population urban centers that are thousands of kilometers away from the center of Tripoli. So many of these steps, in my view, are either on the way, being done, and perhaps Gaddafi can be persuaded in the final analysis to leave the country with his family, and some deal can be worked out that would save Libya the worst possible effects of an outright battle.
Let's put that to Izzaldin Sharif then in Manchester. Is it ultimately going to take people in Gaddafi's inner circle to turn against him for him to be toppled from Libya?
Well, the situation can tell us something could be different as well, because Gaddafi is holding the major war equipment, which can harm a lot of people. Damage also could be the oil. The international community, they have to understand this. I can't see very, very clear light at the end of the tunnel. Gaddafi gave his statement. I know that he is coward enough to leave, maybe change his personality or whatever, or just disappear. But